Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
The whole thing I'm about to tell you started around 3 years ago, and to this day, I still don't have an explanation for it. I've gone over it in my head more times than I can count. I've blamed wildlife, random coincidences, people messing around in the woods, pretty much every logical explanation I could think of. None of them explain everything that happened. Looking back now, I think whatever was going on had probably started long before I noticed it. 3 years ago was just the first time it made itself impossible to ignore. I'm not expecting everyone to believe me. If somebody had told me this story before it happened to me, I probably would have rolled my eyes and come up with a reasonable explanation. Unfortunately, I was the one living through it. I live in a pretty remote part of the Appalachian Mountains. There are a handful of houses scattered around the area, but mine sits farther back than most of them, surrounded by miles of hardwood forest in almost every direction. The closest paved road is several minutes away, and once the sun goes down, the place gets unbelievably quiet. There's also a pretty well-known campground not too far from my property, so seeing unfamiliar vehicles every now and then has never been unusual. People come through all year to hike, camp, fish, or just spend a weekend away from civilization. I've lived in that house for 15 years, and until all of this started, nothing remotely concerning had ever happened. I've seen black bears, coyotes, bobcats, all kinds of wildlife. The animals usually stay away from people, and if you leave them alone, they return the favor. That's just how it works out here. Which is why the first thing that caught my attention didn't even seem like a big deal. One night I got home from work after a long shift, probably a little after 10, and noticed a white cargo van parked in a small clearing between the trees not too far from my driveway. It wasn't on my property, but it was definitely closer to my house than I would have expected someone to camp. My first thought was that it was kind of odd. Personally, if I were spending the night in the woods, I'd rather be farther away from someone else's home, not closer. When I mentioned it to my wife, she looked at it completely differently. She said maybe whoever was staying there had never camped somewhere that isolated before and actually felt safer being within sight of a house. The more I thought about it, the more sense it made. If our situations were reversed, she admitted she probably would have done the exact same thing. By the following morning, the van was gone, and I figured that settled it. Someone had spent the night there and moved on. Except when I came home from work that evening, the van was parked in the exact same spot again. I still didn't think too much about it. Maybe whoever owned it was driving somewhere during the day and returning at night. The part that bothered me happened much later. Around 1 in the morning, I walked outside to take the trash down to the bins, and when I looked toward the clearing, I noticed someone sitting inside the driver's seat. The man wasn't asleep. He had a pair of binoculars pressed to his face. What immediately stood out wasn't that he was awake that late. It was what he was looking at. He wasn't watching my house. The binoculars were pointed deep into the woods on the opposite side of my property, almost like he was waiting for something to come out of the trees. I stood there for a few seconds trying to figure out what had his attention, but I also didn't want him noticing me staring back. I quietly went inside, tried looking through one of the windows, but from that angle, I couldn't really see the clearing anymore. I told my wife what I'd seen, and for the first time, she agreed that something about it felt off. Sitting alone inside a van in the middle of the night, watching the forest through binoculars, wasn't exactly normal behavior. Even so, we locked the doors like we always did, checked the windows, and eventually went to bed. The van was gone again the next morning. As I was walking to my truck before leaving for work, I noticed something that definitely hadn't been there the day before. Just off the edge of my yard, almost directly in front of the house, there was a hole dug into the ground. It wasn't huge, but it also didn't look like someone had used a shovel. The dirt had been ripped apart, and there were long claw marks running through the soil. We'd seen bear tracks before. We'd found signs of coyotes and other predators plenty of times over the years. This looked different. More importantly, it was way too close to the house. Wild animals around here usually avoid homes unless they're desperate or someone has been feeding them. Standing there looking at those marks, I remembered the guy sitting in the van the night before. Maybe he hadn't been watching another person after all. Maybe he was watching whatever had made those tracks. The van disappeared again for the next 3 nights, and little by little, I convinced myself I was reading way too much into the whole thing. Then, a few evenings later, I came home and saw it parked in exactly the same place again. This time, I decided I was going to talk to him. It was around 10:30 when I walked over to the clearing. He must not have heard me coming, because the second I got close enough, he spun toward me and immediately pointed a rifle straight at my chest. I threw my hands up without even thinking. After a few tense seconds, he realized I wasn't there to cause any trouble, lowered the rifle, and cracked the driver's side window. He warned me that I shouldn't be outside after dark if I valued my life. Naturally, I asked him what he meant by that. He explained that he was out there tracking a creature that had supposedly appeared in some confidential report years earlier, before the records disappeared. According to him, there had been multiple sightings somewhere around this part of the mountains, and he'd spent months trying to verify whether any of it was real. Honestly, I figured he was just another guy chasing Appalachian legends. Every year, people come out here convinced they're going to find Bigfoot, monsters, secret government experiments, or whatever else the internet is obsessed with that month. I left that conversation feeling more relieved than anything else, because at least I knew he wasn't sitting out there watching my house. I headed back inside, locked everything up again, and told my wife about the conversation. That's when she mentioned something she hadn't told me before. 2 days earlier, she'd found a dead rabbit behind the house while she was clearing some brush near the tree line. It hadn't just been killed. It had been torn apart, almost shredded, like some predator had ripped it to pieces. She hadn't said anything because she assumed it was just wildlife and didn't want me worrying about it while I was at work. The second she told me that, my mind went right back to the hole in the ground outside and those strange claw marks. For the first time since this all started, I found myself wondering if the man in the van wasn't as crazy as I'd originally assumed. At the same time, I kept telling myself there was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation for all of it. Maybe the guy in the van really was tracking some kind of wild animal, and somewhere along the way, he'd convinced himself it was some undiscovered creature. There are plenty of people who spend their lives chasing stories like that. I wasn't about to believe his explanation just because I'd found one strange hole in the ground and my wife had found a rabbit torn apart behind the house. Neither of those things proved anything on their own. Around here, wildlife does strange things all the time. The problem was that, later that same night, something happened inside my own house that I couldn't explain away quite so easily. We have 3 cats, all rescues, all of them pulled out of some pretty rough situations before we adopted them. Despite everything they'd been through, they're unbelievably gentle. They don't hiss, they don't fight, and they barely even scratch each other when they're playing. During the day, they love sitting by the windows, watching birds and squirrels, but at night, they usually disappear into quieter parts of the house and sleep somewhere tucked away. That night was completely different. All 3 of them walked over to the front windows and just stood there staring outside. Every few seconds, they'd arch their backs and hiss into the darkness. I'd never seen them behave like that before. It wasn't playful or defensive. They looked genuinely terrified, but at the same time, they refused to back away from the windows, almost like they were trying to warn us that something was out there. At first, I figured they were reacting to the man in the van. They'd never seen him before, and maybe his presence alone was enough to make them nervous. That seemed far more believable than anything else running through my head. Since I couldn't really see the clearing from inside the house unless the van was parked in exactly the right spot, I decided to step outside for a better look. That wasn't unusual for me. I went outside late almost every night to take the trash out or check around the property before going to bed. I grabbed a flashlight, opened the front door, and started walking slowly toward the edge of the yard where I could usually see the clearing through the trees. Before I even made it halfway there, I heard something coming from the woods. It sounded like an animal eating. Wet, repetitive licking noises, followed by slow chewing. Out there, once the sun goes down, the darkness is absolute. Unless there's a bright full moon, you can barely see a few feet beyond the tree line. I stopped walking and turned toward the sound, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The instant I did, the noise stopped completely. Everything went silent. Then I saw them. 2 eyes reflecting back at me from just above the ground. My first thought was that it had to be a mountain lion, or maybe some other large predator. My body locked up before my brain had time to process anything else. I knew enough about predators to understand that running was the worst thing I could do. If it was a cat, I'd immediately trigger its instinct to chase. So I started backing away as slowly as I could, keeping my eyes fixed on those 2 reflections in the darkness. Then the eyes started rising. At first I thought the animal had simply lifted its head, but they kept going, higher and higher, until whatever they belonged to appeared to stand upright. I don't know how tall it actually was, because I couldn't make out a body, only those eyes, but I knew it was far too tall to be a person. Too tall for a bear. Too tall for anything I'd ever seen in those mountains. Every logical explanation disappeared in that moment. I wasn't looking at an animal I recognized anymore. I wasn't even looking at something I could identify. Whatever it was stayed perfectly still, staring directly at me, and every instinct I had screamed that if I stood there another second, I wasn't getting back inside. I turned and sprinted for the front door. I don't even remember unlocking it. I just remember throwing myself inside and slamming it shut behind me. Barely a second later, something hit the outside of the house with enough force to shake the wall. It wasn't loud because of the noise itself. It was loud because of how heavy it sounded. The entire house seemed to absorb the impact. My cats completely lost it. They started hissing even louder, clawing at furniture, running through the house before disappearing into the darkest corners they could find. I locked every door and window as fast as I could. My wife had been in the shower, but even over the sound of the water, she'd heard the impact. She came running out, still soaked, asking what had happened. All I could tell her was that there was something outside. I didn't know what it was, only that it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. She suggested opening one of the curtains to see if it was still there, but I shut that idea down immediately. Whatever had hit the house had done it with incredible force, and I had no interest in finding out whether it could get through a window if it wanted to. I'm not sure she fully believed what I'd seen that night, but the next morning she walked outside with me and saw the deep claw marks carved into our front door. She didn't have an explanation for those either. At the very least, she agreed that some kind of large predator had been on our property. From that night forward, everything about our routine changed. We stopped going outside after dark altogether. During the day, life stayed mostly normal. We went to work, ran errands, took care of the property, everything you'd expect. But the second the sun started setting, we were inside with every door locked. I stopped taking the trash out at night and started doing it before leaving for work every morning instead. I even asked my employer if I could switch to an earlier shift so I'd always make it home before sunset, especially during the winter when it gets dark so early. Thankfully, they approved it. That's basically how we've lived ever since. I wish I had some satisfying explanation to give you, but I don't. It's been 3 years now. Since then, we've found more dead animals scattered around the property, always torn apart in ways that don't look normal. And one of our neighbors disappeared without a trace. Nobody knows what happened to him. Maybe he left town. Maybe something else happened entirely. I have my own suspicions, mostly because I know he liked taking long walks through the woods after dark. I'd warned him more than once that there was a predator around and that he shouldn't be out there alone at night, but he never seemed concerned. Maybe it had nothing to do with his disappearance. Maybe it did. I'll probably never know. What I do know is that whatever I saw standing in those woods wasn't human, and it wasn't any animal I've ever known to exist. A couple of summers ago, my girlfriend Emily, my best friend Josh, his girlfriend Megan, and I decided to spend a long weekend camping somewhere that hardly anybody ever went. My uncle had told me about this little lake tucked deep in the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky, surrounded by miles of thick hardwood forest with no houses, no cabins, and no cell service. The only way to reach it was by hiking a narrow trail for about 45 minutes from an old gravel parking area that the Forest Service barely maintained anymore. Most people avoided the place because the hike wasn't easy. There weren't any campsites with amenities, and the lake itself was rumored to be too remote to bother with. That sounded perfect to us. We got there in the late afternoon after the hike in, and the place looked unreal. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the trees that covered every hill around it, and aside from birds and the wind moving through the canopy, there wasn't another sound anywhere. We pitched our tents just above the shoreline, built a fire ring with some old stones we found nearby, and spent the evening grilling hot dogs and drinking a few beers while talking about work, college memories, and all the stupid things we'd done over the years. Nothing crazy, just enough alcohol to relax after the hike. By midnight, we were all exhausted, threw a few more logs on the fire, and crawled into our tents. Sometime during the night, I woke up needing to pee. My head felt a little foggy from the beers, but otherwise I was wide awake. I stepped outside as quietly as I could so I wouldn't wake Emily, walked a few yards away from camp, and while I was standing there, I happened to glance out across the lake. At first I figured I was looking at some animal standing on the opposite shoreline, because I could see what looked like two bright eyes reflecting the moonlight, almost exactly the way a cat's eyes glow when headlights hit them at night. Then I realized something that made my stomach tighten. The eyes weren't staying in one place. They were slowly moving across the water itself. I stared for several seconds, trying to convince myself I was just misjudging the distance. But whatever I was looking at seemed to have a head barely sticking above the surface, and it was moving silently in my direction. Every time I shifted a step, those glowing eyes seemed to stay locked on me. I remember whispering to myself, "There's no way I'm seeing things." Between being half asleep and having a few beers earlier, I convinced myself I was imagining it. I hurried back into the tent, zipped it shut, and just lay there listening to my own heartbeat for what felt like 10 minutes. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to look outside again, and whatever had been there was gone. I laughed it off, figured the alcohol and the darkness had played tricks on my eyes, and somehow managed to fall back asleep. The next morning, I didn't even mention what I'd seen because it sounded ridiculous the more I thought about it. We spent the day hiking around the lake, skipping rocks, taking pictures, and just enjoying how peaceful everything felt. By evening, the temperature was still unusually warm, and Megan suggested we all go swimming before it got completely dark. Emily loved the idea immediately. Josh and I weren't nearly as enthusiastic, but the girls were already laughing as they stripped down to their underwear and waded into the water. They both called back that the lake was surprisingly warm. I told them I'd join them after I got the campfire going. Getting the fire started turned into way more work than I expected. The wood looked dry enough, but every time I thought I had a flame going, it died out again. Josh eventually took over while I kept feeding him smaller sticks. That's when Emily suddenly screamed. At first I thought she was joking around until I looked up and saw her throwing both arms wildly into the air. Megan started yelling that something had grabbed her. Emily disappeared beneath the surface for a second before coming back up, gasping. I took off running without thinking and splashed straight into the lake. By the time I reached her, the water was only around waist deep. She was panicking so badly she couldn't even get words out. I grabbed her by the shoulders and pulled her toward shore. She stumbled away from me, breathing hard, then suddenly turned around and screamed. Before I could even react, I felt something clamp around my right ankle with unbelievable force. It wasn't slippery like a fish. It felt solid, almost like fingers ending in sharp hooks. A stabbing pain shot through my ankle as whatever had me squeezed even harder. I kicked backward as hard as I could with my free leg until I finally felt it let go. I nearly fell getting back onto the shore. Emily was already sitting by one of the coolers, pressing both hands against a deep cut just above her ankle. Blood was running down into the dirt. I looked at my own leg and found an almost identical wound. It wasn't huge, but it was deep enough that blood was pouring out. I grabbed the first aid kit from my backpack, cleaned both cuts as best I could, and wrapped them tightly while everyone kept asking the same question over and over. What in the hell grabbed us? Josh guessed maybe some giant snapping turtle. Megan wondered if it had been an eel somehow. Emily shook her head immediately. She said it didn't feel like teeth or a fish. She said it felt like a hand with claws. The second she said that, I thought about those glowing eyes I'd seen the night before. But I kept my mouth shut, because even I still wasn't sure I believed what I'd seen. We got out of the water and basically collapsed back into camp, all of us scrambling for the first aid kit like it was the only thing keeping us grounded. We moved close to the fire, hands shaking, trying to clean and wrap the cuts before they got any worse. Nobody was really talking at first, just breathing hard and looking at each other, like we were waiting for someone to explain what had just happened. The blood, the adrenaline, the shock of it all, it made everything feel unreal, like the lake had just flipped from peaceful to something else entirely in a matter of seconds. Eventually, we managed to get the bleeding under control and sat back down near the fire, but we were nowhere near calm. We were all in panic, trying to make sense of something that didn't make any sense at all. We didn't know what that thing was, not even close, only that it had grabbed us with real force, like actual hands, not a bite mark, nothing animal we could easily recognize. Josh kept saying it had to be some kind of freak accident, like a beaver or a turtle or something huge that we'd somehow startled. But even he didn't sound convinced. Megan just kept repeating that what she felt wasn't teeth or scales. It was grip, pressure, strength, like something was holding on with intent. Then we heard a splash somewhere out on the lake. Less than a minute later, there was another splash, heavier this time, followed by another. It sounded exactly like someone slowly walking through shallow water. Emily and Megan both wanted to leave right then, but Josh grabbed 2 flashlights and asked me to come with him to see what was making the noise. We walked to the shoreline and swept our lights across the black water. At first there was nothing except reflections from the trees. Then Josh quietly said, "Don't move." His flashlight stopped on something maybe 40 yards from shore. I aimed mine at the same spot, and my stomach dropped. A head was sticking just above the surface of the lake. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer, and it definitely wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. The eyes reflected our flashlights exactly the way I'd seen them the night before, glowing like a cat's in the dark. It didn't blink. It just stared straight at us. Then it slowly rose a little higher out of the water, enough for us to hear another loud splash, as if it had been standing up beneath the surface the whole time. That was enough for both of us. Josh yelled for the girls to grab everything important and forget the rest. We didn't waste another second. We threw our wallets, keys, phones, and backpacks into the truck after the hike back to the parking lot and drove out of those mountains as fast as we could. None of us said much during the drive home. The following afternoon, I went back with my uncle to collect the camping gear we'd abandoned. The tents had been ripped into strips. The coolers were scattered all over the campsite, covered in long, deep scratches, and almost everything we'd left behind was either broken or torn apart. I finally told him everything, including what I'd seen standing by the lake the first night before any of the attacks happened. I even showed him the cut on my ankle. He looked around the lake for a long time without saying anything, before finally admitting he had absolutely no idea what could have done it. We packed up what little was left and left that place for good.